Did you know that when the waiter pours you that small amount of wine from the bottle you ordered off the wine list, you're probably doing this one thing wrong? If having lunch with a new love interest or maybe with a business partner, here's who should pay and why the choice you make with the check reflects heavily on you as a person. This episode of Got Some will have you saving money, sharing better bottles, and fearless when it comes to wine tasting. Well, this podcast, Got Some, is not only about drinking wine or learning more about wine, it's also about how to experience wine. And I was very lucky to have Master Sommelier, the co-host of this podcast, Carlos Santos, host me at his restaurant, Vue du Monde, where he was the head of wine for nearly 10 years. And it was an incredible experience. And what I took away from that was the level of professionalism that he holds in what he does in regards, but also the experience of etiquette of what I was receiving, whether it came down to the placement of cutlery, the choice of glassware. And so if you're on the wine journey as I am, the next step going past assessing wine is how to prepare and how to share appropriately. That's why we're very lucky to have Dr. Clinton Lee on. Dr. Clinton Lee is a master of etiquette, and he has a book called Master the Art of Manners, Modern Day Etiquette for Any Situation. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for chatting to us on Got Some.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Angus. Happy to be here.
How do you make it look like you know what you're doing at a wine tasting?
I like the question, make it look. All right. So I want to share my thoughts on this. Personally, I don't think there's any shame in not knowing that much about wine. It's not expected of you. You're not an expert. You're not a professional. But knowing some basics certainly wouldn't be of any harm. I would suggest that you need to know how to hold the glass, first of all. You don't want to put your grubby little paws on the actual wine glass itself. So, if you're having canapes or hors d'oeuvres and you're picking up the glass and you're switching glass, you're going to have all these oily marks. So you don't want to do that. The second one, they always talk about you swirl it, then you sniff it. These are very basic aspects. You may not know why you're doing it, but remember, when you're enjoying wine, it's for yourself. It's not for others. As long as you don't leave yourself in a position where you're looking foolish. So hold the glass in a correct manner. When you're swirling, make sure you don't have too much wine, and then nose it. Now, what I would always recommend, nose the wine, because if you nose the wine and you smell wet cardboard, nail polish remover, or vinegar, the wine is not suitable. You should give it back. That's something you ought to do. And as for the rest, I get aromas of green apple, lemon, citric. That comes with practice. The other aspect is, I think is very important, the sipping part. And most people will see professionals sip some wine and they'll go like this, take in the air. They themselves are somewhat hesitant to do that. And I can understand why, because they don't know why they're doing it. But privately, practice with that exercise. Take in water in your shower and then, take it in, gargle and spit it out. So when you are in public, you are already practiced that maneuver several times. And you then, as you put it, you will be able to make it look like you know what you're doing. But one thing I would also suggest is, if you're not sure, ask others. Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Dr. Clinton Lee, when a waiter asks for your opinion of a wine that you've ordered, as in they've taken the cork off or they've untaken off they've done the screw cap, they pour you that little taste. Right. What is the proper etiquette to assess that wine and give it the A-OK?
In most cases, the sommelier will give you the cork to look at, and you can examine the cork, you can nose the cork, and if there's nothing untoward, that will be step one. The second step is, you would sight the wine to make sure there's no debris or anything like that untoward. And sometimes there is. And then give it a good swirl and nose it. Now, I want to make a clarification here. So, Angus, you and I may have a particular wine that you've ordered. We both tried. There's nothing wrong with the wine. but we don't like it. In that case, you don't return it because there's nothing wrong with the wine, but you just happen to not enjoy it.
This is one, I'm engaged, so this one necessarily isn't for me, but it's for all the young punters out there on the
Congratulations.
single scene. Oh, thank you, Dr. Clinton Lee. How to get out of an awkward conversation around splitting the check. What's the best way to approach splitting after dinner with someone who's drank either more or better wines than you?
Okay, before I answer that question, Angus, a couple of questions. Is this the first time? Is it a business meeting? You're engaged, so clearly it's not a lady. Or if it is a lady,
Let's
we
break it
won't.
down into those sections then. Let's
Sure.
ask firstly, on a first date. Let's say I'm just getting the house white and all of a sudden she's getting an Opus 1 by the glass under Coravin.
If that is the situation, if it's a first date and you've made the invitation, I think when you've made the invitation, you should be very clear. You could say, well, this is our very first date and I'm happy to pay for the meal. Once you've said that, then I think you should try and control what is on offering if you're a bit concerned. If, on the other hand, you say, look, it's our first date and I'm a very open, liberal man. I'd like us to split the check, or we just pay for what we drink. Make it very clear at the onset. All right. So that would be for your personal, social. If, on the other hand, it's a business meeting and you have invited the client, or you are inviting the other party of which you have a keen interest in solidifying a relationship, then I think you really ought to be the one that pays for the bill. There's absolutely no talk of splitting. That's my advice to you.
Just got to hope that the business that you do is in the thousands and not hundreds. Otherwise, the lunch itself will take a while to cover.
Well, that's a good point, Angus. May I answer that?
Of course.
In which case, I would recommend that when the wine list comes by, you take care of the wine list and you say, look, we're having this for lunch. May I recommend these 4 types? And you have an idea. Now, in Asia, they will choose one more specifically higher, one lower, and 2 in the middle. And depending on what you choose in price-wise, and depending on what you choose, it's also an indication of you being the other person who finally selects the wine. What type of person are you like? In a way, a business meeting is a sort of cut, thrust, and parry and get to know who the other side is.
Good point. Next one. Stop paying too much. What do you believe should be the markup on wines on restaurant lists?
Very interesting question. It's generally known that at higher end restaurants, in terms of the final bill for the meal, the percentage in terms of alcohol is generally between 70 to 80%. In a more sort of average, everyday restaurant, it might represent less than 30%.
I understand why, but could you help for people who don't understand why there is such a discrepancy, the difference between fine dining and your local Indian restaurant on the corner?
Well, your fine dining, they're very particular. There's clearly a chef that has trained for an enormous amount of years. Their experience is, unquestionable. Going to such restaurants, the fine dining restaurants, it's not just the food that you're there for. It's the entire experience, the service. And as such, you are having the services of a qualified wine expert. So the markups there sometimes can be as high as 200%. And whereas if you are at a restaurant, which is your mom and pop, more everyday, they would just have a list there, you choose, and then they'll just bring the bottle and open it for you and leave you to your own judgment. But there is a third alternative, Angus. And the third alternative is where there is an increasing amount of restaurants that allow you to bring your own bottle, and they will charge you a corkage fee. And that corkage fee, which I find understandable, they are using their fine glassware. If one is broken, at least it's covered. There's the service that goes with it. So the markup can be significantly higher. Now, you have to bear in mind that at fine dining restaurants, they're not serving you a basic Australian Shiraz, or Riesling from Eden Valley or Clare Valley. They are serving you wines that are significantly higher priced, and therefore, when you add a 200% markup to it, the numbers start to reach the sort of stratosphere.
I think it's also a really good point. Talking about, I've got an Indian restaurant on the corner. It does great food, incredible masala. I haven't had wine from there before, but they do have a wine list. But then, comparing that to Vue de Monde in Melbourne, which is one of the fine dining establishments I spoke about, where Carlos worked for a long time, you are in a heritage Australian skyscraper called the Rialto. You're on one of the top floors overlooking Melbourne. I was lucky enough to be there at sunset. And so you are paying for that experience and that percentage difference of the rent of having Hugh Allen, the executive chef, of having the 20 staff working, and of course having two master sommeliers working at the same time on the floor. That's why that markup does exist. So I think people do struggle to understand it sometimes, but it does come down to a lot of it overheads. And really, when you break it down, after all of those expenses have been encompassed and put into the spreadsheet, you are probably only looking at 20 or 30% markup on the wine itself. Very similar to the mum and dad restaurant.
Ultimately, your bottom price after all the costs is still profitable, but not as much as you think.
Exactly. The literal age-old wine debate, answered by an etiquette expert yourself. Cork versus screw top.
I think we've got to look at that from several different lenses. From the client's point of view, from a server's point of view, the guest and management. So from the server's point of view, it's a lot easier to open. It's just a quick turn of the wrist, and then you can start serving. So in a very busy restaurant, it saves a lot of time, and you're able to cover more tables and guests. Generally, from the client's perspective, what are they expecting? If they're going to be paying $600-700, I think they would want to have a cork as opposed to screw. They also bearing in mind the ambiance and the perception. That's one. From the management's point of view, they need to sell. So for them, efficiency, speed is quite important, as well as profitability. Interesting fact, though, we have the Australians to thank for the onset of the screw cap, because they were exporting so much wine to the UK, and there was a huge volume of corked wines because they were using cork. At that time, I think the return was about 7%, and that's when the advent came that, let's start with screw cap. So in terms of the guest, they may want to have that little prestige, that cachet to say, oh, this is a wine that uses cork. From the server, in terms of what they are looking for, let's do this quick, and then let's get it out and I can move on to the next table. Management, they're probably a balance. The balance being, yes, they want guests to be happy and served quickly, but they also appreciate the higher end guest. And then, of course, I would say you've got to consider the storage and turnaround. So if your turnaround is quick, you might want to focus more on the actual screw cap.
Master the art of manners, modern day etiquette for any situation. This is Dr. Clinton Lee. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us about the proper etiquette around wine, glassware, eating out and cooking at home. We really do appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Angus. Very, very insightful questions. Thank you very much for having me.